Good morning. It's good to be here, and it's good to see you here. And this quarter, Drew has led us into the study of the parables. And as a reminder on parables, we have direct from Drew. Parable is a transliteration, and I won't even try to pronounce the Greek word, but it parabella, I think, or parabelli, and it is two words, compound. Para means alongside, and bole means to throw. So a parable is a story that is thrown beside a spiritual truth. This becomes important in our study this morning, that we understand what a parable is. We also have steward, and what is a steward? And stewardship is someone who manages another's wealth. It is a steward is compatible to our financial managers of today. And as we look at relationships in today's society, in common law, there are two kinds of relationship. One of those is an arm's length relationship between a buyer and a seller. And it's most commonly used in a business or a relationship. You do not necessarily have access to the seller, and the seller doesn't have access to the buyer, but it is a relationship that's arm's length. A lot of us call that customer service too. But there's another relationship that we'll talk about this morning, and that's fiduciary. A fiduciary relationship is one between a doctor and patient, between a lawyer and a client. And a fiduciary means that they are putting the other's interest ahead of one's own. I know that most of you know Tony, and that parent relationship is fiduciary, as your parent to your child. You put their interest above. But in his particular case, I had to go to court to get legal guardianship because of his age. And in that legal guardianship, the courts said that I was a fiduciary of Tony legally. So I have a legal responsibility, and which is a fiduciary responsibility. We all should have a fiduciary responsibility in our life. The important thing about the steward is serving the master faithfully. And in 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 2, moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. So Christians are called to be fiduciaries. And Jim, you're going to come and read Ephesians 6, verses 5 through 9.
Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours, is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him.
As you read Ephesians 6, you can see that a worker has a fiduciary responsibility to the employer, and the master or the bosses have a fiduciary responsibility to those who he is supervising. We should thank God for what we have and use it as he directs. Listen as Deuteronomy 8, verses 11 through 18 are read.
Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statute, which I command you today, lest when you have eaten and are full, and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness, in which were fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty land where there was no water, who brought water for you out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and that he might test you, to do you good in the end. Then you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained me this strength. And you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he swore to your fathers, as it is this day.
Even though this is from the Old Testament, it still applies in the sense that whatever we have, God has given it to us. The Christian should say, what's mine is a gift from God. I'll share it. In Luke chapters 14 through 18 is like walking with Jesus on a daily basis. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem from Galilee. In chapter 19 of Luke, he enters into Jerusalem in his final days of life on this earth. And we should remember that this is a letter, this is a document written by Dr. Luke. It does not contain chapters and verses, so when we look at this chapter, or this chapter 16, let's go back and review a little bit. In chapter 14, we see that Jesus heals a man on Sabbath. And the Pharisees was upset about that. And Jesus said in verse 5, and he said to them, which of you having a son or an ox that is falling into a well on a Sabbath day, will he not immediately pull him out? In other words, circumstances sometimes leads us to do physical work when we maybe shouldn't. Parable of the wedding feast. This is a parable about a man going and sitting in a seat of honor, and then maybe the master comes and tells him to go to a lesser honorable seat. And Jesus says, basically, humble yourself and sit where the humble sit. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And then at the great feast, it's all about people not coming that have been invited, and we should be coming as we have been invited to the big grand banquet. Verse 24 says, I tell you, none of these who were invited shall taste my banquet. It continues with the cost of discipleship, and we know that it says make sure that you review the cost of discipleship, and it's saying, therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. And then we have the statement that salt without taste, it would be worthless. So as we go into chapter 15 of this, we have the parables of one. You remember the lost sheep and they going out and saving the lost sheep. You remember the coins, and the lady lost a coin and she went and searched and brought it back. I want you to notice in both of these examples in the parable that the parable was alongside a truth, and the truth of the sheep was related to a man who had been reconciled, and in that reconciliation, repentance. And the same thing with the lost coin. The coin was an inanimate object, and that coin represented someone teaching him, and he repents. And then we have the prodigal son. And we all know the story of the prodigal son. We know the story of him wasting his inheritance, coming back, the brother not being happy with the banquet. We know all of those things about the parable. So, why mention the previous parables? And my clicker and me are not in the sync here. But why should we, the parables of one, so why should we talk about these parables? In Matthew 13, verses 34 and 35, all these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the fountain of the world. Ask yourself, am I ready to die? In Luke 16, we're going to go through a parable this morning. There are 40 parables that God, our Lord and Savior, gave in the New Testament, and all parables that were given was given by Jesus. And we know that they were designed to hide the truth from unbelievers, but reveal it to believers. Those who have ears, let him hear. Parables was, in a sense, a judgment, a confirmation of rejection. At the same time, they were a light to those who had the ears to hear. And we find that this particular parable is designed to help believers, as they all are. Luke 16 is the most provocative chapter in Luke and maybe the Bible. This chapter reveals more about the afterlife than any other chapter in the Bible. There's one parable and one story. As we get into this, it's interesting that Luke ends with the prodigal son, as we call chapter 15, and he begins with the unjust, corrupt, or unrighteous steward who is wasteful the prodigal son, prodigal means wasteful. So we have the wasteful son, and it's followed by a wasteful manager. This is an illustration of how we should live, we as believers. So let's get the story. In Luke 16:1, and I've got two translations, and the reason for the two translations is I want you to make sure that in one translation it says steward, and the other translation it says manager, and they mean the same. He said to his disciples, there was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. And as you can see also on the screen, you do a lot of editing, and I still missed the fact I put the verse up there twice, so excuse me there. So he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you no longer be steward. And in the ESV translation, it's accounting for management and being a manager. So it's all there. So what can I say? It's audit time, right? This manager has placed himself in an audit of his stewardship. We as Christians have the same thing. In Romans 14:10-12, why do you pass judgment on your brother, why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God, for it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God, rather. So then each of us will give an account of himself to God. And in 2 Corinthians 5:10, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one of us may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. So this steward gets a notice of this audit. And his answer is, he said to himself, what shall I do? Since my master has taken the management away from me, I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. If you'll notice here, the steward did not defend himself. He was not asked to clean out his desk. He was given a notice. He was also told that he was not going to go save his job. That's not possible. He knows that's not possible, but the rich man wants an accurate record of his irresponsibility. He wants to know exactly what he's done. This is a bad policy, a very bad policy. If you fire someone, what do you need to do? Walk them out the door, right? You don't say, go back to your desk and clean up your mess. You walk them out the door. This manager had a bad policy. So it says that if you give someone notice, and if you put them back in, they're going to back in and take some vengeance or revenge, and they're going to go back in with a target, goal, objective of a personal gain. And that's exactly what this steward did. And Luke 16:4, and the manager said to himself, 4, I have decided what to do so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their homes. The manager needed to be welcomed by some people into their homes. Who are those people? And he says, I know who it will be. It's the people that I've been working with who owe my master. I need a place to live, I need food, I need a future career, I need status, I need to be where I am. And I need to be in important places, in the homes of important people, so I have a plan. I have a plan. And the plan is this. While he's still in authority, his future nests by taking advantage of his current situation. Guess what it is? It's all about self. But please have an open mind as we journey through this parable. The master isn't Jesus, and the steward may not be as unjust or unrighteous as we might think. Life teaches us presumptions can lead us down the wrong path. So in 16:5, so summoning his master's debtor one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. You know, con artists, shammers, or scammers, should I say, what do they want you to do? Here, sign here, sign here, sign here, right? Quickly, sign here quickly. And in verse 7 it says, then he said to another, and how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. Everyone's a little twisted here. And you might say, well, it's not a lot. This is how people in the world operate. This is how it works. People in the world are maneuvering to outwit its owners. He secures his future. He literally secures his future in this way. And then something unexplained happens. Well, going through that, he's going to write down his masters. So, how many of you think that this guy is a crook? How many? To all appearances, he's a crook, right? But just keep this in mind. I'm not trying to sell it, but I just want you to keep this in mind. We do not know the practices of the business relationship between an owner and a steward at that time. So the percentage that he gave away, which is a lot, one is 50%, one is 20%, may be in fact his compensation that he's giving away. But that's just another thought process that I'll bring into this. But what I was going to say about this is he was still in office, and So this is a surprise. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. Well, did it stop working? No. The master did, in fact, well, did I hit it too many times? I apologize. Yeah, there it is. Master did, in fact, approve the steward's shrewdness. This is a shock element to us in this parable. The master praised the unrighteous manager. What's he praising him about? Well, he's not praising him about his incompetence or his wastefulness. He's not praising him about embezzlement and deception of the owner. He's praising him because he acted shrewdly. His owner praised him for acting shrewdly. What did this guy do? What did the manager do? He used what he had, his assets, the wealth of unrighteousness, to purchase dwellings for his future, the temporal future. That's what the perverted, wicked sons of this age have always done and always will do. You, he says, need to be at least as shrewd as they are. He's talking to believers. And this is an old rabbi or rabbinic approach. It's reasoning from the lesser to the greater. If the wicked, perverted sons of this age use every imaginable approach to secure their temporal future, shouldn't we be careful how to act in regard to our eternal future? Again, that's a style of teaching from the rabbis, from the lesser to the greater. In verse 9, and I tell you, make friends with for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. Christ is really saying that the wealth of this world will fail, but we have a greater vision than that. In Luke chapter 16, verse 10, one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. It's not about how much we have, and it's not about who you are. It's about priorities. It's about whether heaven is in our hearts as a priority. This is an axiom or a truism. It's basically self-evident. It doesn't need an explanation. It's just a truism. It's never a question of how much you have. If you're concerned about the advancement of the kingdom and you're committed to making friends for eternity, you will give what you have freely and generously, joyfully. Verse 11, if then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? So what happens here? If you're unfaithful in what you have in your unrighteous wealth, does it affect your spiritual and eternal blessings? Everything that we have on this earth is temporal. Everything is going to burn up. Do you remember Luke 6, verse 38? Give, and it shall be given unto you, good measures, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. You can't outgive God. And Paul says to the Corinthians, sow sparingly, reap sparingly. In other words, sow bountifully, and reap bountifully. You cannot outgive God. In verse 12, and if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? This is another sting. What do you mean by another's? He's talking about the wealth of unrighteousness. The use of unrighteous wealth corresponds to the use of that which is another. The wealth that we have isn't ours. He was wasteful with someone else's resources. And then the final part of this parable, it says, no servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one, love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve two masters at the same time. What is Jesus teaching us? Why do we go back? How does it apply to our everyday life? How does this parable come to us? If we go back to the review of the parables in chapters 14 and 15, do you have preconceived ideas as you read those parables? For example, what is your preconceived idea of sheep in that parable? Coming from a flock, right? We are sheep going from one of us strays, and then the shepherd goes after us. It's a tale of something that can't protect himself, cannot lead himself. He cannot do hardly anything by himself. And then we have the inanimate object a coin. How does that relate to us? And then the prodigal son, do we judge the father right, the older son wrong, the prodigal son, as he's called, wrong at the beginning and righteous at the end? It is my belief that we should not consider either the steward or the master, because as we stated from the beginning, this parable is alongside of truth. So it doesn't really matter in the story that the master is not very good master, or the steward is not very good steward. It matters that for us as believers to know and get what this parable is trying to teach us. There are several lessons regarding living among non-believers in a non-believing world. And I'm sure that there are more lessons in this than I have picked up. So I encourage you to read and study this. But I think lesson 1 we've already talked about. Each of us will face an audit. And it's an audit of our stewardship. It's a stewardship of our unrighteous wealth. It's a stewardship of our time. And he called him and said to him, "What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager." We will also be called into an audit. Lesson 2 is we should use our resources to win people into the kingdom. And he said the people in this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than the people of light. The people of light should be conscientious, should be fiduciaries of their employer, and they can't do some of the things that this person was doing. This should be part of lesson 2, but this unjust servant is people of the world. And he sought to make his life more comfortable, and he did so cleverly. And the people of light should act shrewdly, wisely, and not dishonestly, and should exploit worldly wealth, as we just read in verse 9. We should use our resources to win people. In verse 9, Jesus said, one is to use wealth, not store it up, or be a servant to it. Wealth should be the disciple's servant, not vice versa, and wealth should be used to gain friends. And lesson 4, we should use our resources to win people into the kingdom. Jesus used the word wealth in verse 13 when he affirmed that one cannot serve both God and the love of wealth for its own sake. And then the disciples would then be welcomed into eternal dwellings. And lesson here, if we're faithful in our use of money, the unrighteous wealth, then we can be trusted with greater things, verses 10 through 12. Remember, there's nothing secular before the throne of God, and we cannot divorce spiritual from the material. And then the last thing that I have here is that we are to be single-minded. You cannot have two masters any more than you can walk in the two directions at once. Luke 16 includes two, and I say parables. One is a parable and one is a story. And it's about wealth, and it's about the right and wrong use of riches. The steward's parable was spoken primarily to the disciples. And if you go down to verse 14, the people who did not believe were laughing and scoffing at what Jesus just said because they did not know what to believe. And it is kind of disturbing until you realize that Jesus was teaching a lesson, that he was commending that steward for his shrewdness. And remember that, if I can hit the button. Remember, a parable is thrown beside a spiritual truth. And regardless of how the master or the steward acted, this truth in this parable is to use our wealth wisely. So in Luke 16, 1 through 13, this is a master and a steward. It teaches spiritual truths. I would encourage you to read the rest of chapter 16 for insight on how to use wealth unwisely. So the possession of wealth is a means God has employed for you to secure eternal rewards and heavenly friends. Pretty good offer. You're going to be there forever. Your capacity to worship, praise, and enjoy God in eternal glory is bound up in what we do with the wealth of unrighteousness. Say, this world is acting shrewdly. They are, using a bad term, they're conniving to secure their temporal future, their future here on earth. But they have no future beyond that. As we read and study Luke 16, verses 1 through 13, we should be thinking, what are we doing with our wealth to further increase the kingdom of Christ? I thank you for your attention, and have a good day, and we'll be worshiping here in about 15 minutes. Thank you.